By the time the small group had returned to the car, it was lunchtime. Anwen couldn't help but feel hungry. She hadn't done so much jogging in a long time. Running for her life didn't count. At the very least, this trek would keep her in shape, she thought as Tyler handed her a bottle of water. The sun shone down on the trio, heat reflecting off the car. The plains were decidedly hotter than the mountains, and the vehicle felt like an oven inside.
Good thing we have air conditioning,
Walter noted as he shielded his eyes against the sun.
All the same, I hope we can reach the Duros River by nightfall.
Tyler ducked into the driver's seat, silently agreeing with Walter about the air conditioning.
We won't make it unless we get back on the road,
He reminded.
I'm more worried about the last part of the clue. It could mean pretty much anything. With such a large area to explore, who knows exactly what we're looking for? The walker sure didn't want to make it easy on us.
Anwen got in the front passenger side of the vehicle, leaving Walter to take the rear. She'd grown tired of sitting back there like some little kid. The majority of her thought it about time someone else had the privilege.
Guess we'll find out when we get there.
She mused. She pulled out the map from earlier and traced the general route with one finger. There was a town this side of the river they could stay at for the night, if they got there in time. She wasn't keen on the idea of camping out again when there was the possibility of a bed. Tyler turned the key in the ignition. There was a horrible grinding noise before the engine went silent. He tried turning the key again with no result, except for the visible beginnings of smoke wafting up from under the latch. Popping the hood, the Dragon Lord got out to check on things. When he opened the hood, billows of smoke poured out and he had to step back, coughing as he did. Anwen felt the tickle of smoke in her throat as Tyler fought off the explosion of steam and other vapors. This soul-sharing thing kind of sucked, she decided. It was nowhere near consistent. The connection tended to share out the less awesome parts of each other's experiences. She climbed out to see what was going on, trying to stand downwind of any further smoke. Tyler rubbed on his forehead, leaving a smudge of black there.
Well, I hope you had insurance on this thing.
He told Walter as the veteran joined them.
Because it looks like we're not going anywhere anytime soon unless we either get a new car or start hoofing it.
I thought you could do anything.
Anwen said as she looked in at the engine.
Even fix this.
She wasn't a mechanic, nor did she know much about cars, but surely Tyler could fix a little brake or whatever it was. With a funny sort of snort, Tyler shook his head as he lowered the hood back in place.
Not anything.
He corrected.
Yes, I can manipulate matter, just like any other dragon, but I'm not into mechanical objects. I leave that to the pros. Besides, the metal seems stressed and won't fix with the ease you think it should.
He tried to wipe his now grimy hands off on his jeans, realizing it would likely stain at the last moment. But it was too late, so he just finished what he was doing. Walter dug out a cell phone and tried calling the hotline he'd been given for such an emergency. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough signal to make the call.
Cheap junk,
He said, kicking the tire. Well, at least it had gotten them this far. Maybe the darn thing had overheated and blew the radiator or something. Anything was possible. Except for them using that car again. The sun continued to radiate down, causing a sort of heat haze over the whole area. The tall grasses swayed in a slight breeze that did nothing to cool them off. Tyler frowned, arms crossed over his chest as he contemplated their options. They were too far away from any town to get immediate help. That was the problem with remote locations. And they couldn't stay there indefinitely, hoping someone would come rescue them. That was even less likely to happen.
I say we keep going on foot,
Tyler announced.
As soon as we get to an area with reception, you can call the rental company and they can go get the car. If they want more money, I'll deal with that later.
Anwen couldn't help but groan, tramping through a sort of desert. Even if it wasn't technically one, didn't sit high on her list of priorities. But there was nothing for it but to get going. The longer they waited, the closer the revenants came to the mountain, and the more they ran out of time. Either way, it didn't look good. Without another word, she went to retrieve her pack from the trunk, pulling out the others with it.
Let's get this over.
She sighed, hoping they'd make it to a decent resting place by nightfall. 5 long hours later, even Walter was dragging as the sun began to slide behind the mountains to the west. They'd come a long way, choosing to cut through the open plains instead of going around it. It cut off some of the time, though the going was rough. There were no paths, so they had to make one. and if it hadn't been for Tyler's sure sense of direction, they'd have ended up going in circles hours ago. The only thing that made it worth it was the sight of lights in the distance, and judging from the amount of lights, it might be a small town, or at least a farm. However, it was still some good distance away. With the light failing, navigating the area between was becoming more difficult. At least it was for the veteran who didn't have night vision like the other two seemed to have.
Can we call it a night in camp here?
Walter asked as he leaned against his pack. They'd stopped to take a break and he'd removed it with a weary sigh. He was ready to fall over, if he was being honest. Not even his old drill sergeant had been that grueling of a taskmaster. Guess there was something to be said for being at the mercy of a dragon lord, he thought. Anwen didn't seem too far behind in her sentiments. Despite her dragon sight, she had no desire to keep going, regardless of how close the end might be. Her legs were starting to stiffen as she stood there, and even though the sweat she felt trickling down her back had cooled her off a bit, she was more than ready to call it a day. Tyler took a moment to evaluate the condition of his team. After some careful consideration, he found he had to agree. The lights were too far away for them to reach them in the next hour or two.
That's fine. We'll set up camp here, but we'll be off first thing in the morning.
Vakeda shrugged out of her pack, pulling the one-man tent from the top. She was still getting used to setting the thing up, but at least she managed without help from the others. One day, she thought, she might even be as proficient at setting up a tent as Tyler and Walter were. But she also hoped she wouldn't have to find out. The two men finished their tent before Anwen did, and while she struggled to get the poles straight, Walter went to collect some stones to make a fire pit. When Tyler offered to help her, she declined, so he left her to it and went in search of fuel for the fire. By the time she'd finished with her task, the other two had completed theirs. Anwen couldn't help but cringe at the smell from the fuel Tyler had found, though.
Cow dung?
She asked with a wrinkled nose. While the dried stuff burned well, it gave a less than pleasant odor. Tyler gave a wide gesture.
Look around. Does it look like we have any trees for lumber? This is a more than acceptable fuel source. Besides, the grass would burn too fast to work. It's this or nothing.
Pursing her lips, Anwen chose to ignore the slight, disapproving tone. Even her parents had gotten on each other's nerves from time to time. She supposed all relationships must be like that. So instead of giving voice to her frustration, she hunkered down with her mug of soup. She even tried to ignore the somewhat frustrated tone he'd used. It had been a long day.
I wonder what the others are doing.
She mused.
You know,
Tyler said as he sat down next to her.
there is a way to find out.
He played with the handle of his soup mug as he stared into the fire.
It's not the easiest technique, but I'm sure you could manage it if you gave it a try.
Walter, though curious, didn't comment. Dragon and mage magic was something he'd probably never really understand. It wouldn't matter how much theory he might learn about it.
I'm more worried about what those revenants are doing. That last vision you had made it sound like they're on the move.
Tyler had to agree with his assessment. He knew it was more important to know the Revenant's intentions and progress. Unfortunately, it wasn't something he had any control over. Anwen's visions seemed to come as they would. However, a brief viewing was more than doable, if Anwen was willing.
I'd rather not see any more revenants.
Anwen announced in the resulting silence.
I've had more than my fill of them.
Unfortunately, she knew she'd get even more before all was said and done. But hopefully with the help of the other mages, it would be a short duration. Taking a sip from his mug, Tyler shook his head.
Be that as it may, it might not be a bad idea to see how far they've gotten.
He had his own misgivings about such a task, but if they were on the move, the trio might have less time than they'd first thought. Anwen let out her breath in an elongated exhalation.
Isn't having visions of them enough?
She asked, looking up over her mug. She hadn't taken so much as another sip as she waited for his reply. Realizing he wasn't going to answer right off the bat, she decided to lay out what they did know.
We know they're on the march.
She looked towards Walter in hopeless appeal, knowing he had no real say in the matter. Walter put up his hands in a helpless gesture.
Hey, don't look at me.
He intoned.
I know next to nothing about this kind of stuff. But From a strategic point, it makes sense to gather as much intel as possible.
It wasn't what she'd wanted to hear, and they all knew it. But in the end, it was up to her. She already had some sort of connection with these creatures, and part of her figured Tyler didn't want to tip his hand too soon on that end. He would show her what to do, but wouldn't do it himself. Either he was scared and with good reason, or he wanted her to try for some other reason she couldn't fathom. She closed her eyes and willed her heart to stop pounding.
Fine, I'll do it.
She relented.
But you're going to have to tell me what to do.
Tyler took her at her word as he set his mug aside.
Before we do that, we should have a few precautions in place.
He explained.
A viewing is best done using some medium, such as the fire. But things can sometimes get out of hand, so it's best to have a way of cutting it short, if you know what I mean.
Walter and Anwen watched as he formed a small bucket from some dead plants nearby. He then somehow siphoned water from the ground to put it in the bucket. It didn't take much time to understand what he'd meant with this preparation. If things got out of hand, all someone had to do was put out the fire to end it. Hopefully it wouldn't get to that point. Sweat beaded on Tyler's forehead and he wiped it away. The area was relatively dry and pulling water from the ground had taken a bit more effort than usual.
Now,
he turned to Anwen.
A viewing is kind of what like some fantasy books call scrying. Essentially, you conjure up a sort of portal to whatever you want to see. It's generally a one-way connection. I have heard of the occasional feedback though, hence the precaution of the water.
Anwen nodded her understanding, her mouth going dry. She wasn't sure she liked the idea of any kind of feedback. Revenants were scary enough in vision. She didn't want one connecting with her.
Okay?
She said, clearing her throat.
How does it work?
Tyler moved to stand behind her, hands on her shoulders.
Look into the fire and envision what you want to see. Concentrate with your inner sense. With enough concentration, the image should present in the flames. As the connection strengthens, we should see what they're doing.
Licking dry lips, Anwen nodded once more. She didn't like the idea of focusing on the enemy. It somehow seemed like bad luck. But if it meant they'd get a better idea of what they were doing, it had to be worth it. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The Keda had a good up-close look at a revenant, thanks to her last visionary encounter. And though she was far from happy about it, she focused on that image. The fire crackled. Walter moved a few steps back. The colors fluctuated from the typical to something almost black and gray as he did. It seemed as though someone had sucked out all of the color from the flames. In the heart of the fire, an image formed, jagged and unnatural. It resembled a dragon, but one made of dark spikes and obsidian stone, with 2 pricks of glowing red for eyes. The thing reared its head, the flames high into the sky.
Who dares to look upon me?
Anwen gasped as she opened her eyes. The revenant seemed to look right through her. She could feel Tyler's fingers tightening on her shoulders, almost digging into her flesh. The voice was something more felt than heard. It rumbled like boulders trying to crush bones to powder. The deep tones thundered up through her feet and made her brain buzz.
Trying to spy on me, are you? That will not do.
The thing laughed in a harsh manner that sounded like nothing wholesome. Instead, it reminded them all of decay, death. Anwen's knees buckled underneath her. She felt pain shoot through her body as her soul scars flared to life. A scream escaped her lips before she clamped them closed. Her teeth clenched against the pain. Walter froze in shock as both Tyler and Anwen fell to the ground. It reminded him so much of that one night when they'd gone to retrieve Watkins from the storage locker. And he had no idea what he could do to stop it, as the thing in the fire laughed and laughed. It was the worst sound in the world. The sight of his friends writhing in agony made him want to puke. It seemed much worse than that one time. Their faces looked contorted as they tried to hold back their screams. A breath of wind caressed Walter's cheek. A hint of childlike laughter drowned out the sound of their agony in his mind.
Put out the fire.
The veteran suddenly remembered the bucket of water and reached for it. In his haste, he almost spilled it, but managed to throw its contents towards the fire instead. The motion doused the flames like someone snuffing out a candle. The coals smoldered a bit before going out. As the fire died, both Tyler and Anwen seemed to have some relief. Their muscles began to relax, with only a few spasms here and there as the pain faded. Seeing their reactions decreasing, Walter went to their sides to check vitals. Thankfully, their pulses were both strong, if not a bit erratic. Exhausted, the two companions lay where they'd fallen, eyes closed. Their chests rose and fell in tandem as the cool of the evening rushed in to take the place of the fire's warmth. The breeze that had touched Walter's face made the tall grasses rustle in an oddly soothing song. It soon had the two calmed to a more natural sleep. Walter heaved a sigh of relief.
Thank you.
He said to the air, not sure where the voice had come from. He knew he'd heard it before, though, high in pitch and so youthful. A giggle filled his mind in response.
Love you, Uncle Walt.
The veteran shook his head as if to clear it. Where had he heard that voice before? Why had its owner called him Uncle Walt? He didn't have any nieces or nephews that he knew about. He decided it wasn't worth the effort of figuring out. Instead, he pulled out the camping blankets. With an effort, he draped them over his two friends. He supposed he could have rolled them up and put them in their respective tents, but he felt it wasn't necessary. The stars were bright above them, with no hints of rain, and he felt a sense of protection enveloping them, kind of like a hug. He believed that whoever owned that voice would look out for them that night. He pulled his own blanket over his body as he settled down for the night. The ashes of their fire now lay cold in the makeshift pit.